If you're of a certain internet age, you no doubt recognize the line, "all your base are belong to us." Oh yeah, 18-year-old video, 240p quality. This is classic. Mwah. This is vintage. I always associate it with those Hotel Mario cutscenes, stuff that forms the primordial soup for memes as we know them today.
I hope she made lots of spaghetti.
Obviously, a line like that doesn't just happen by accident. Nobody accidentally typed that sentence out in replacement of its original Japanese text. It was interpreted as such by a translator. But the question then becomes why? Or rather, how? I promise I'll make this as interesting as I can. I got a great guest on today. Please, I'll make it interesting, I swear. Zero Wing is a horizontal space shooter released in Japan in 1989. There you go, now you know the name of the game. Don't forget it like I did in Teal's quiz and look like a big silly. It's pretty standard as far as these arcade shooters go. Looks like it'd be a decent time, and I could see myself spending plenty of 20p's at this machine. Maybe not 50p's though. It got a release on home consoles in Japan and Europe in 1991. Sorry Americans, you guys missed out. It was for the Sega Mega Drive, a system doing very well in Europe at the time. You gotta remember, the NES wasn't as big a hit in Europe as it was in America in the 80s because of the home computers most households had back then, as Ashens said in an excellent quote.
Yeah, basically this did not sell well in the UK at all, the old NES. It was barely a thing. I mean, you could buy one, but it did not sell well here, and it did not sell well in the whole of Europe, actually. Really, we all had the old 8-bit computers, and sometimes the 16-bit, actually, because this wasn't released here until 1986.
I'm going to take his word for it because he was actually existent in the 80s. If you want to play it now to check it out, there's an official version on Steam, and there's one on the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack thing. The thing is, the European release required translation, and they couldn't just run it through Google Translate. For more help in understanding exactly what this was supposed to say, I asked my friend Emma. She speaks Japanese and German, as well as English, obviously, has a master's in localization, and works in the industry. If anyone was going to be an expert on this that I knew, it's her. And sure enough, she had plenty to say about the common misconceptions that localization gets. To start, she went into detail about the two different types of localization. I didn't even realize there were two types, so it was really interesting to hear her talk about.
We have two ways of translating things. We have the domestication route and the foreignization route. The domestication route is more like bringing the source content closer to the target audience. So for example, you would take a Japanese video game and you would make it more accessible to English speaking gamers or players, whereas the foreignization route is kind of like othering the audience. If you play a video game and there's lots of Japanese words left in there, for example, they might say onsen instead of hot spring. It's trying to keep in traces of the source culture, whereas domestication is kind of trying to not push it away, because I don't necessarily think it's bad. It's trying to make the target audience think that what is being produced has been made for them specifically, even though it hasn't.
We also discussed the idea of adapting a reference for an audience's common knowledge.
So we talk a lot about what we call culture-specific references. You know, say for example, there's a comedian who's had some kind of scandal or something, and they make a joke being like, oh, he's just like so-and-so, whatever comedian this is. I can't think of a very good example right now. But you have those extra textual references that are like, you say this guy's name, that implies, I don't know, random example, but like cheating scandal or this or that and the other. You can't use that guy's name in the English because you don't have that extra textual reference, if you know what I mean. So then that's where adaptation comes into it. You would have to find a similar either celebrity or whatever it is that evokes the same kind of meaning and reaction.
And Emma brought up a fantastic example using an old Japanese fairy tale I'd like to elaborate on now. Depending on the type of movies you've seen, you may be familiar with the idea of, wow, loads of time has passed, but it feels like mere moments for us. It's a fairly recognisable trope, particularly in fantasy and sci-fi. The example Emma gives is the bit from Interstellar.
Every hour we spend on that planet will be 7 years back on Earth.
But because the Japanese have a well-integrated fairy tale about a man who has this exact experience, there's actually a name for this exact trope in Japan, the Urashima effect.
I had this massive reference to this Japanese folktale about a guy who travels to the bottom of the ocean, and when he comes back to the top of the ocean again, 300 years have passed, and it's called the tale of Urashima. In Japan, that is known as like the Urashima effect, but because there's no fairy tale or whatever that explains that in English, you have to find other ways to say it. Whenever there's a pop culture reference with so much like extra textual information, unless you've got something identical in the target culture, you have to change it. And especially in video games, it's not just about like, oh, do I understand this? It's about, do I enjoy this?
See, I told you it'd be interesting, huh? Now, before I started the interview, I had a funny little idea where I'd ask Emma to translate the original Zero Wing dialogue. That would have been super cool and really funny if Emma hadn't mentioned her biggest pet peeve during one of her answers.
One thing that is kind of like a pet peeve as a translator is when people will be like, hey Emma, you speak Japanese, can you translate this? And I'm like, you're gonna need to give me like at least a couple hours. Like,
oh shit.
I'd love for you to say the Japanese, absolutely.
Do you want to play
it? Exactly.
You're not gonna tell me where this is from, which is fine. But I'm very, very, very intrigued as to where the hell this is from.
The Zoom call cut out while she was translating the dialogue. I was hoping to get a reaction when she realised it was Zero Wing, but thanks to Zoom, all we have is this. You know, actually, I almost prefer it. Here's what she came up with in, like, 10 minutes of translation.
何者かによって爆発物が仕掛けられたようです。メインスクリーンにビジョンが来ます。連邦政府軍のご協力により、君たちの記事はすべてキャッツがいただいた。せいぜい残り少なくない命を大切にしたまえ。頼むぞ、ゼイク。我々の未来に希望を。
Emma was really close to what the original text wanted to say.
You're very, very close with a lot of what you said.
Really?
Actually.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And you might be confused as to why that's kind of a big deal. I think there's a general misunderstanding among the general public that localization is as easy as find and replacing Japanese with English. Emma describing how this kind of translation tends to happen made me realize just how difficult a job it must be.
One of the things that kind of shocked me when I started studying localization is the idea that a lot of the time we're doing all of this without any context. There's so much red tape and NDA signing that has to happen because, you know, leaks really jeopardize the video game industry. And obviously, if you've got to have access to the entire code and dialogue and everything of the game, you're like a prime candidate to be able to leak it, if you know what I mean.
Seriously, imagine trying to effectively dub a scene that looks like this.
Let's see what's on the 905, shall we?
That right there is how dubbing is normally done.
I also studied like dubbing as well in my master's, which obviously is a huge part of the video game industry. Sometimes what will happen is that you'll have such a lack of context that all you will get is a tiny clip of somebody's face, like of somebody's mouth moving to match the like lip movements. You have to judge just from that what kind of scene it is, what kind of mood this person is in. It's trying to do a lot and convey a lot with a tiny amount of information, and it's really hard.
The video game industry is notorious for only sharing information about projects on their own terms, and this poses a major difficulty in localization, even with stuff as basic as menu text.
One of the programs that's very heavily used in video game localization is a program called MemoQ. It's essentially just like a translation software where you get files and it's what we call strings, which is just strings of, they could be dialogue, they could be menu text, any text that you see within the video game is just sent through to you, and you get like a bunch of strings on one side, and it's like the source text on one side, and then space for you to translate it on the other side, and you haven't got a clue where any of that is in the story.
Localization is one of those truly thankless jobs, in my opinion. One of those jobs where you only really appreciate it when you barely notice how good it is. We all notice when it's bad, though. Kind of reminds me of motion capture, actually. So here's the thing. The moment an art medium becomes global, they inherently accept localization as being a crucial part of the art form, even if they don't explicitly say it. There are certain things that you simply can't just straight up translate word for word, which is what makes this job an artistic discipline, in my opinion at least. And in the opinion of my expert guest, whose opinion on such matters are much more worth listening to than mine.
Because it is still a creative discipline.
Oh, definitely. It's 100% a creative discipline. Like, a lot of people describe it as an art. I think it's an art. It's taking inspiration from something and creating something out of it, which isn't that not dissimilar to what art is anyway. Most of the time you get minimal context as to what the hell is going on, and you got to make something out of it. It's super challenging, but I love it.
Here, let me give you an example. If you're from an English-speaking country, you probably recognize the phrase, "It's raining cats and dogs." You know what it means, and you know what I'm implying when I say that. However, in French, the direct translation is "Il pleut des cordes." Sorry about the pronunciation, I'm a Spanish learner myself. See, in France, the idiom is more like saying "it's raining ropes." If you think that doesn't make sense, well, neither does cats and dogs, dude. They also don't understand the phrase "to set the record straight." Remettre les pendules à l'heure directe. Remettre les pendules à l'heure directe. I am so sorry to any French speakers. That's the phrase that's said over there. And the phrase's direct translation is more like to set the clock to the right time or something. Same basic principle, correcting something that is wrong, but they use a whole different metaphor for their idiom. It's interesting that we have these completely variant phrases to express the same thing, but it means that if you're trying to adapt a joke from English to French, or vice versa, that relies on understanding the subtextual context of the phrase, you have to completely rewrite the joke. I used to watch a lot of French and Belgian cartoons dubbed into English growing up. Don't ask why, I don't know either. And I feel like that's where I got this specific memory from. I think it was a scene in an episode of Lucky Luke or Too Tough or something, where they see ropes falling outside and one of the English voice actors says, "It's raining cats and dogs out there." And I sat there and went, "No, it's not. It's raining ropes." They rewrote the joke, but it doesn't work now with the imagery. If that anecdote turns out to be wrong, I'm going to sound like a fucking lunatic. One thing I know is right is that the kids in Too Tough used to call their teacher ma'am.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi there.
We were kind of, busy.
Presumably this is what French kids call their teachers, but we in the UK call them miss. Functionally the same word, but given the context the characters use it in, one is clearly more appropriate than the other. That's a pretty minor example, but the point is it's not as easy as just translating the words into English and making them make sense. You sometimes have to completely reimagine how a scene might play out to give it the impact the original artist intends. That, my friends, is part of the localizer's job. With that in mind, let's play a game. I'm going to give you the Japanese name for a Final Fantasy weapon. I'm not going to say it because I'm going to take a guess, but I'll show you it on screen. The name of the weapon is also a phrase in Japanese, so it does have an inherent meaning the reader will understand in their native language. And I'll show you that too. Your job is to come up with a name in English for it. Ready? What did you decide on? The official translation in game is Furin Kazan. God, I hope I say that right. I'm never writing a script in another language. Which is also a Japanese battle standard, kind of like a flag specifically used during war battles, and is actually a reference to Sun Tzu. But my initial instinct was to call it something like the Fifth Element. But do you see how different the interpretation could be with such little context? Be honest, how close was your guess to Furin Kazan? This, right here, this is the reason all your base are belong to us came to be. Remember when that was the point of the video? Me either. Some guy on the team whose English wasn't exactly up to par tried to translate as best they could without realizing how important the job they were doing really was.
Even given that piece of information and there being so much of the personal reading into it and stuff. Doing this like you do, well, it fits pretty solidly with what their original intentions were, which just, I think, goes to show how important good localization is and how good you are at it.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I mean, the LQA department will probably tear this to shreds, but...
Well, I didn't ask for that. I gave you 10 minutes to translate a meme, and you did a great job, so thank you.
Localization is not just translating media. It's... You know what? Emma said it best.
I think localization deserves more credit as a tool for cultural exchange.
Think of how many episodes of a Japanese show you watched growing up, be it Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Pokemon, or Yu-Gi-Oh! Think of whenever you watched a foreign film like Parasite or Old Boy, not that one, and used subs to understand it and appreciate the nuance of the dialogue and the performance.
I think of the countries where they're not represented because they don't have things translated into their own language. But I just feel like if it was supported more and if it was appreciated a bit more, we would all be able to appreciate each other's culture a bit more. And also another thing, think about all the countries where they have like small little indie devs where they produce games in their own language, and without localization into English, for example, how are those games going to grow? I feel like if people appreciated it a bit more, the localization industry would get better and better. We'd have better localization. We'd have less people complaining. We'd have people understanding that, you know, there's not just one answer. And we'd all get to play more video games and other forms of media.
Which is always a plus.
I hope that with this video, I made you think a little bit more about how important this kind of thing really is. Also, hey, why not check those films out? Parasite in particular is excellent. Don't let the language barrier get in the way. There is a whole world of cinema that is excellent and deserves your time. And people like localizers make it easier than ever. I alluded to it earlier, but I made a video about another overlooked aspect of game development. Check out my video about motion capture if you're interested. Or indeed, look at my playlist with some of my favourite videos. I upload a lot of barely related content, so I understand not all my videos will appeal to everybody, but I really appreciate you sticking around while I fulfill my weird little creative whims and find my voice and my feet with this channel. I hope the next video I make will be relevant to your interests. And if you made it this far, I'm glad this video was. Unless you fell asleep while watching this, in which case I hope you have autoplay turned on. Oh, and I won't make the end music too loud, don't worry. Get some sleep.